Good morning. Good morning, everyone. More than a fleeting trend, the green transition is one that concerns everyone in every country, and more people are realizing it. In fact, according to recent data by the Green Finance Platform through its Green Finance Measures database, there are some 684 national and subnational policy and regulatory measures on green finance in place in 100 developed and developing countries. This represents a 264% increase since 2015. So, how does the Philippines fare compared with these countries? With 8 years left before the 2030 deadline stated by the Paris Agreement, is the country on track to achieve its environmental goals? How are the country's policymakers enacting change to facilitate the Philippines' green transition? How has the private sector aided in these efforts? Today, we have three resource speakers who will share their insights on the subject matter. We will start with their opening statements. Our first speaker is Ferdinand A. Pecson, the Undersecretary and Executive Director of the of the Public-Private Partnership Center of the Philippines. Before joining the PPP Center, he worked at FL Schmidt AS as Performance Director and Executive Team Member leading the O&M business in Africa and the Middle East. He also had worked at Holcim Philippines, Deere and Company, Price Waterhouse Coopers, Baknotan Consolidated Industries, Solid Cement Corporation, FINMA Inc., and the University of the Philippines. Yusek Pekson, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, and good morning. Good morning
Good
to
morning, sir.
everyone, to my fellow guests. Thank you for this opportunity to share what the PPP Center is doing to facilitate bankable yet green and sustainable projects. This facilitation has three aspects. First is the assistance that the PPP Center provides to implementing agencies in project development. To this end, we are fortunate to have the support of the Asian Development Bank, which provided funds to the center's project development and monitoring facility. Qualified agencies can use the facility to procure transaction advisors for the conduct of feasibility studies, the preparation of project documents required by the approving bodies, and the drafting of the PPP contract. Among the key issues that these advisors cover are risk identification, risk allocation, and risk mitigation. And among the plans advisors prepare are those for the mitigation of the project's environmental impacts. Second is the formulation of enabling policies. In 2018, the PPP Center drafted and obtained approval from the PPP Governing Board a policy entitled Safeguards in PPPs, Mainstreaming Environmental, Displacement, Social, and Gender Concerns. This facilitates and provides guidance in incorporating environmental and social safeguards in the PPP delivery process from project preparation to contract implementation. Third is the appraisal of projects for bankability and sustainability. The PPP Center is one of several agencies comprising the ICC Technical Board whose tasks are to evaluate projects and to decide whether a project merits elevation to the ICC Cabinet Committee, which is the body that approves infrastructure projects. For its part, the PPP Center looks at whether the project's cash flows are sufficient to service debts, at whether the project's financial model includes the cost of mitigation, and whether the terms of the contract include measures to mitigate the identified risks. This assures that risk mitigation a key driver of sustainability, is integrated into the projects. However, there remains more to be done in terms of enabling green and sustainable infrastructure. Implementing agencies must strive for greenness and sustainability of the projects that they develop. The so-called output specifications for PPPs must be expanded to include green and sustainability linked key performance indicators that the project must achieve. To this end, the government must set the minimum standards for greenness and sustainability, not just for the construction phase, but also for the operation and maintenance phases. In this respect, private partners will have a higher chance of success if they are responsible for all phases of the project. On the other hand, incentives must be formulated to improve the viability of green and sustainable projects. The mainstreaming of safeguards I talked about previously could be a requirement to be imposed by the approving body. The appraisal of projects could also stand improvement, given that green and sustainable projects typically require higher investments but lower operating and maintenance costs compared with conventionally designed projects. The appraisal of project costs should shift to the appraisal of full life cycle costs, particularly when comparing alternatives such as the choice choosing between diesel powered versus electric powered trains, or the choice of a project site, or the choice of a mobility solution like between toll road versus LRT. Furthermore, the economic benefits of greening or of making infrastructure sustainable should be included in conducting an economic analysis. Finally, contract terms and conditions set by the approving body must include achieving green and sustainability linked KPIs. Three sectors that have tremendous impact on the country's sustainability development goals are water, energy, and solid waste management. Making these sectors more attractive to investors require policies that would enhance competition. We also need policies that set clearer rules to guide investors, such as the pending waste to energy bill. We also need stronger regulation to level the playing field between green and sustainable projects and less sustainable and less environmentally sound projects. For example, investment in costly solid waste management projects would be unattractive in the absence of the enforcement of regulations on proper solid waste disposal. In summary, what we need on the government side is a whole of government approach involving policymakers who set the rules for greenness and sustainability, project implementers who develop projects according to those rules, oversight bodies and regulators who ensure that the private partners in a PPP follow those rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusek Pekson. Our second speaker is Jean-Marc Arbogast. Mr. Arbogast is the country manager for the Philippines at the International Finance Corporation, which is a member of the World Bank Group and the largest global development institution focused on the private sector in emerging markets. A French national, he was formerly the advisor to the IFC Vice President for Corporate Strategy and Resources, where he helped formulate and articulate IFC's strategic priorities while aligning resources to deliver the country's ambitious agenda. Mr. Arbogast, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning,
Sir.
everyone. Good morning, colleagues, and good morning, fellow panelists. It's a real pleasure to be here. And first, let me say that I'm really glad we're having this conversation today. Climate change is probably the most pressing global issue. And I think the key to solving it is better public and private collaboration. So I think the topic today is really spot on. So IFC, being the largest development finance institutions focused on the private sector in emerging markets, I will specifically speak about the role of the private sector in the green transition and why PPPs are so important. But before I say anything else, let me also mention that at IFC, we are putting climate action at the heart of our work, and we have committed to align 100% of our financing to the Paris Agreement goals by July 2025. And we have also agreed that 35% of the projects will be climate finance. IFC is part of the World Bank Group, as you probably all know, and the World Bank Group is actually the largest multilateral provider of climate finance for developing countries globally. And just to give you an example, over the past 2 years on an annual basis, we have invested over $20 billion per year in climate. Now, having said that, we all know the green transition will be costly, very expensive. Getting to net zero by 2050 will cost an extra $3.5 trillion a year, according to a new study by McKinsey. And surely for the Philippines, that means an extra tens of billions of dollars every year. And that's a large chunk of the country's GDP. Can public sector do this alone? No. Not in a post-COVID environment when government fiscal headroom is constrained. And, we've seen here public debt to GDP going from below 40% pre-pandemic, and now it's over 60% in a matter of 2 years. So the cost is too high for the government to bear it alone. And therefore, private sector has a real role to play, private sector and PPPs, of course. We also think that the private sector typically is more efficient, more cost effective, and it can also deliver very innovative solutions. The private sector is very uniquely positioned because I also think it can accelerate investments commercially and at scale very, very quickly. And, at IFC, we've seen that, especially in the renewable energy space and green building space. In Africa, for example, we have this scaling solar program that delivers, solar PV to countries across the continent. And that's been very successful because of the involvement of the private sector. And here closer in the Philippines, we have our Edge Building Certification program, which helps developers to reduce their building energy and water consumptions while lowering GHG emissions. And lastly, on the private sector, I also want to say that it's a driver of job creation, and job creation is a very important aspect of our agenda here in the country. The green transition can create new jobs, new skills will be needed. For example, maintenance engineers for windmills or the digital aspect as well. Now, okay, can private sector do this transition alone? I don't think so either. I don't think at the required scale and speed, alone not possible. We need significant government action also. We need a coalition of public and private sector actors that where government action can really create the necessary regulatory and institutional framework to foster innovation and investment. And to be maybe just a bit more specific, what I mean by that is we need, governments to calibrate policies to provide incentives or counter disincentives. We don't want to have the wrong incentives. Set quality and technical standards in new sectors. Support skills, training and development. In the city space, maybe adjust spatial and urban planning. And of course, invest in research and information platforms. So we need public financing, but I think we need to reserve public financing for projects only where other options are suboptimal. To give you a sense, at IFC, we have identified about 10 priority sectors for building back better and greener. Most of those sectors today are actually investable, bankable sectors, with the exception maybe of the last ones, and I'll talk about those. We can roughly put them in 3 buckets. One is green infrastructure. The second one is climate smart cities. And the third one is transition to green in the industry space. So green infrastructure, what I mean there is the first priority is to decarbonize the grid and scale up decentralized generation and storage. On the city space, it's retrofitting buildings, existing buildings for energy efficiency. It's low carbon water, waste, as Yusek Paxson mentioned, green urban transport, and nature-based solutions. On a transition to green, on the industry side, it's carbon capture, hydrogen, and climate smart agri, and low carbon shipping. All of those are, of course, the last one's very complicated today. But I have maybe two key messages I want to mention here. How to, in order to scale this up, scale up green investments and private sector. One is we need to mainstream sustainable finance. That is extremely important. At IFC, we've done over $500 million of investment in climate finance over the past decade, and we're looking to do more. And the number two key message is we need to create a pipeline of bankable PPP projects, especially in sustainable infrastructure. Without PPPs, we will never reach the scale and impact required. And I think there are tremendous opportunities for PPPs in the country, and we need the government to help them push them along. Now is the time. It's the time to double our efforts for a low carbon future. I think the businesses, companies, and government leaders who will embrace climate as a business opportunity and offer those low carbon technologies, goods, and services will be the front runners of our future. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arbogast. Our third speaker is Erwin O. Avante. Mr. Avante is the Senior Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, Head of Finance, and Compliance Officer for SEC of the Energy Development Corporation, the country's largest 100% renewable energy company. He is also a Vice President in First Gen. And prior to joining the Lovis Group in 1998, he worked as a senior audit in charge at CISEP Gores Velayo and Company. Mr. Avante?
Yeah, good morning, Yusek, Pexon, Jean-Marc, Vic, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me. I agree with Jean-Marc that it is timely that we are having this discussion since the Philippines is among the top 20 vulnerable countries due to climate change. No? So let me share how Energy Development Corporation, or EDC, helps the country pivot into a greener world. EDC is a majority Filipino-owned company, and we are the largest vertically integrated geothermal company in the world and the largest pure-play renewable energy company in the Philippines in terms of energy production. We energize roughly 1 out of 11 light bulbs in the country, all from renewable sources. Apart from geothermal, we own the largest wind farm in the Philippines, owns a 132 megawatt hydro plant, and some utility scale and rooftop solar across the country. Geothermal has a carbon intensity that is approximately 1/7 of the carbon intensity of a conventional coal plant in the Philippines. As a company, we have a negative carbon footprint as our carbon sink is almost twice the CO2 emissions that we generate in our power plants. We take pride in providing the country a service that is reliable, socially, and environmentally responsible. True to our chosen path of forging collaborative pathways to a decarbonized and regenerative future, we created a venue for the investing public to take a strong stand for the environment by participating in our green bonds. Last year, we registered 15 billion worth of ASEAN green bonds with the SEC and listed 5 billion with PDEX. The first tranche issuance was 10 times oversubscribed from the base offer size due to a strong demand from investors who wanted to support and participate in financing the expansion of our 100% clean energy portfolio, which is crucial to decarbonizing while restarting our economy. We kicked off the process of our maiden green bond issuance with the launching of our Green Bond Framework. This was confirmed by Sustainalytics to be in accordance with the International Capital Market Association 2018 Green Bond Principles. We committed that the net proceeds from the issuance shall be used to fund a portfolio of eligible green projects, which will contribute to our country's target GHG reduction of 75% by 2030 compared to business as usual. The good news is that more institutions around the world are already part of this race towards greening our planet as they continue to recognize the reality behind the science of climate change and that saying no to coal is paramount. In May 2021, the G7, composed of the world's 7 largest advanced economies, agreed to stop funding coal projects by the end of last year and to phase out support for all fossil fuels to meet globally agreed climate change targets. More global banks, insurers, pension funds, and asset managers are expected to have new or expanded coal exit policies as demand rises and the world continues to heat up. We likewise laud companies such as Arthaland, Dream Communications, First Balfour, Knowles, Silliman University, and Unilever that have joined us in the Net Zero Carbon Alliance, a community where we empower each other and be a part of each other's journey towards carbon neutrality. The Alliance aims to create ripples of positive impact through pockets of excellence that collectively help heal our planet. The Net Zero Carbon Program is strategically developed to provide partners with a roadmap to attain carbon neutrality by scaling carbon emission offsetting and tracking, as well as assistance in obtaining third-party certification of carbon emissions and offsets, and even access to green financing, among others. Carbon offsetting through our Binhi Greening Legacy is one of the strategies that our alliance partners can avail of. What started as an initiative to bring back to abundance our threatened Philippine native tree species and bridge forest gaps in our areas of operations over 13 years ago has become the country's biggest private sector-led forest restoration initiative and is now ready to help our partners achieve their own decarbonization goals. To date, we have planted 6.5 million trees, covering an area of 9,570 hectares, equivalent to the combined size of 5 cities, namely Makati, Pasig, San Juan, Mandaluyong, and Pasay. A lot of businesses may now avail of the DOE's Green Energy Option Program for consumers, with 100 kilowatt demand to buy low carbon directly, renewable energy from licensed green energy providers such as EDC. If the electricity bill of the institution you represent is 180,000 pesos or more, you are likely entitled to shift to competitively priced renewable energy. It's time you make the choice. Let me close my short presentation by showing a 30-second video to give business owners and institutions an idea on how they can contribute to a greener world by shifting to renewable energy through the Green Energy Option Program. Okay, we can probably just skip that now. Let's all do our part in making our world while we still can. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the forum.
Avante. We move now to our Q&A, and After your presentations, I believe the first question is more for Mr. Arbogast and Yusek Bekson. I'll start with Yusek Bekson because you touched on this topic earlier. How do you think the country is faring with regards to its environmental goals? Specifically, what policies need to be in place that will set clearer rules to guide investors?
Yeah. So I'll answer this question in the context of public-private partnerships because, of course, environmental goals are so broad, and my expertise is quite limited to those that pertain to PPPs. So my answer is that there's still a lot more to be done in order to facilitate green and sustainable infrastructure. So I mentioned about the need for enabling policies, and this would pertain to policies that would define the rules, policies for better enforcement of regulation, which in itself is has to do also about execution more than policy setting. We need also to guide investors in PPPs, uh, especially in those sectors that have a huge impact on the environment, like solid waste or pollution, water, and renewable energy. So some of those rules are still being developed. There are bills as we speak that are uh, in place, but still have a long way to go into becoming laws. So it is quite an exciting time insofar as laying the groundwork for green and sustainable infrastructure. But as I'm saying, much still needs to be done, and this will require the efforts of multiple bodies working together.
Yeah, just a follow-up question because you mentioned waste to energy earlier. Where are we now in that direction, and how happy are you in realizing this?
Yeah, well, there are two issues I recall during the deliberations for that bill. One is whether the use of solid waste would be considered as renewable energy, and as such, being if it is renewable energy, then it would then benefit from the incentives that are being given to renewable energy projects. So that remains to be resolved. The other one has to do, of course, with technologies that involve combustion of the solid waste because of the restrictions being imposed by the Clean Air Act. So during the deliberations of the bill, we also talk about the Supreme Court ruling uh, clarifying what those restrictions are. But still, without without this being in law, being part of a legal framework, it would not be easy to encourage investors to put money in projects like this. So my understanding is a lot of investors are waiting to have more clarity.
Yeah. A same question for Mr. Arbogast. How do you think the country is faring with regards to its environmental goals?
Thank you. Unfortunately, the Philippines is a bit of a collateral victim also of climate change, and rather than an actor. So, but I also see it as it also has its own share of responsibility, and we see, for example, on plastic pollution or waste, that Yusek Parkson just mentioned, which is a very crucial agenda, to tackle. So I think it's been faring quite well, but there's still more to do, especially on the adaptation and mitigation side. On the adaptation side, sorry. So and the other thing I want to mention there is I think there is an opportunity right at this present time and a real one, because the country, there's still so much to build. If you just look, for example, at the energy sector or at the water sector, a lot of infrastructure will need to be built in the next coming decade, and it is an opportunity for for building it greener and making sure these are sustainable infrastructure that we are putting in place. So I really look at the future, and I'm very hopeful, because I think there's a lot of good things we can be doing, and it's critically important because the major customers of the Philippines, if you think about it, will be asking to green their supply chain, for example. So I'm thinking on the data centers, the big tech companies sitting in the US or other places, they want their data centers to be green, and data centers are being built here in the Philippines. So important to look at that aspect. It could even be that the future, we'll see customers of BPOs asking for their operations to be green, for the electricity that's generated to be greener, on maybe in the manufacturing side. So I really see an opportunity, and I think we need to do, a lot more of that in the future.
Thank you, sir. I have a question for Mr. Avante, because you were supposed to be presenting something about green energy option. How big is this program as far as EDC is concerned?
Yeah, thank you for
How
that question.
involved are you in this?
Yes, thank you for that question, Vic. No, the Green Energy Program allows 100 consumers with electricity consumption of about 100 kilowatts and above to actually source their power directly from renewable energy sources. You're talking of large industries, commercials with bills of about 180,000 pesos. No? So in terms of market, it's quite big. Just I think in Metro Manila alone, we have about 6 megawatts, no, sorry, 6,000 megawatts of customers that are eligible to shift for the green energy option program. So it's quite substantial. A lot of people can actually avail of this. I think sooner or later we want this to go down to the retail level, or even 10 kilowatts, for example, so that at least consumers like us, retail consumers like us, for example, will be able to participate in this program.
Thank you, sir. Our second question is, what policies and framework are in place to facilitate an easier transition towards a more sustainable Philippines? What more could be done? We will start with Mr. Arbogast.
Thank you for the question. And look, I think a lot of good work has already been done, by on that front, by the country, by the government, and specifically, I'm thinking of the work done by the regulators, BSP, SEC, one on the sustainability finance framework and roadmap that are fairly recent pieces of work. SEC has done the sustainability reporting guidelines for publicly listed companies. I think this is also very, very critical. And a lot of good work is being done on sort of working on the taxonomy. What is it? What is a green project? What is a blue project? So a lot of guidance is needed. But I think, to me, I go back to what I said a bit earlier. My main message is really twofold. Is one, we need to mainstream climate finance, so bring those new products into life. The thematic bonds, for example, and sustainable bonds, social bonds, green bonds. So that's one of it, and widening the scope of participants, in this type of products. And the second aspect is really on PPPs. I think we just need a lot more of that, and specific policies and regulation that support those in various sectors. Whether it's the waste to energy sector, which again is very critical, and clarifying some of those policies and regulation is very important. So that when investors look at these complex projects, they can actually feel comfortable. And then we, as IFC, we can come in and help the banks get comfortable with those type of projects. We can help the investors get comfortable, and also help structure those complicated projects.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Mr. Avante, same question.
Yeah.
What policies and framework are in place to facilitate an easier transition towards a more sustainable Philippines, and what more could be done?
Yeah, thank you for that question. No? I can only comment, Vic, as far as it relates to energy. No? If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions of the Philippines, about 50% of that comes from the energy sector. Therefore, it is imperative that we deploy one, low carbon energy, and two, improve the energy efficiency within the country. So, with respect to low carbon energy, the Department of Energy has come up with what they call as the National Renewable Energy Plan. It has the goal of renewable energy capacity three times from the 2010 level, from about 5,000 megawatts to 15,000 megawatts. They also issued a moratorium on new coal projects. And then, in addition, there are certain policies that are in place that would promote the use of renewable energy. One is we have what we call as the Renewable Portfolio Standards, or RPS. It mandates electric utilities, distribution utilities, electric cooperatives to actually source a certain portion of their supply from RE sources. We also have what we call as the Green Energy Auction Program. It's like the feed-in tariff, but this time on an auction basis. And then I think the other one, apart from Green Energy Option Program, which I mentioned previously, is what we call as net metering. So, for example, if you have solar panels on your rooftop and you're not using the energy at a particular time, you can actually sell that to the grid. No, so we have those policies and frameworks that are in place that would promote the use of low carbon energy. In terms of energy conservation, I understand that we have this Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act that was passed a few years back. So the purpose of that is to regulate the use of energy efficiency in the country. And at the same time, I think there's a section there that allows or requires government financial institutions to actually set aside funds, for energy efficiency and conservation to projects at very concessional rates. No? So I think those two major ones are really necessary for us to have a sustainable future moving forward.
So just a follow-up question because you mentioned green energy auction. Where are we now in this program, and how interested is EDC in participating in the auction?
Yes. The Green Energy Auction Program was launched by the Department of Energy to actually aid utilities not to actually meet their renewable portfolio standard targets. No? So my understanding is that there is the first wave of auction will be coming soon. And obviously we intend to participate now in that program. We're very much interested to participate in that program. What it does is, if you go back to sometime 2013, 2014, the government introduced the feed-in tariff mechanism. No? So for wind, for example, up to a certain megawatts, so I think 200 megawatts initially, it's entitled to a certain tariff, high tariff above the grid price, the grid rate. And then you also have similar ones for solar. You also have similar ones for other RE technologies. No? And as a result, because at that time, prices of renewable energy was having difficulty competing with conventional technologies at that period of time, you saw an influx of renewable energy investors coming into the system. No? So with something similar moving forward, I think that would also entice a new wave of renewable energy coming into the system because of this green energy auction program.
Okay, sir. I have other questions later. Um, for USEC Pexon, same question, sir. What policies and framework are in place to facilitate an easier transition towards a more sustainable Philippines? What more could be done?
Yeah, so again, I'll talk about how we would facilitate because as government, we don't actually, especially if we are talking about PPPs, we don't own the projects or we don't operate those projects. It would be the investors or the private sector. So we need to put in place those policies that would encourage, motivate the private sector. Uh, Let me focus on one very important issue, which is the way we look at projects. Traditionally, before a project or before a project is approved, the traditional way of looking at the project would be to look at its economic benefits versus economic costs. But the methodology that we are using uh, is still attuned to the traditional benefits and traditional costs. So now issues like resiliency, issues like sustainability and carbon footprint and those things, uh, unfortunately at this time do not factor in into the economic analysis. So what I'm saying is that in order for green and sustainable projects to happen, then we also need to align the way we evaluate projects so that we are able to carry out, especially when we are allocating scarce resources, scarce financial resources. We need to make sure that the projects that we support truly provide us the best return. Or, I mean, I'm talking about economic return on investment. So by by adjusting the way we approve projects, the way we evaluate projects, to consider also the costs and benefits, of course, of green and sustainable options or alternatives, then we will have more of these projects. So this is just one of several reforms, if you will, that government has to look into.
Thank you, sir. Our third question is, how can the public sector encourage more green investments from the financial sector? We will start with you again, Yusek Pekson.
Yeah, so it's all tied together, those questions. So then I'll take on something that is a bit different, and let me talk about regulation. Regulation is something that is very, very important. And in the context of solid waste, we have quite a number of proposals actually for solid waste management. And this would require investments, and they are not cheap. But the question is, will investors be able to recover and earn a reasonable return on those investments? Now, I will just be quite candid. In cities, we are doing a much better job in terms of managing waste. But elsewhere, we still have a big problem. And many of our mayors are even quite candid in admitting that they actually, insofar as where the waste that are collected from their municipalities and towns uh, are concerned, there is always the uneasiness that this could be going to places that are not supposed to be recipients of this waste. And we see this when we travel the countryside, especially, right? So, how can an investor who has to put in a lot of money compete in in a setting whereby there are very cheap solutions that supposedly are not allowed to happen by regulators. So this is one of the challenges that we need to fix. So, and I gave one example in energy, but sorry, in waste management, but that is also true in water, in sanitation, and many other issues that pertain to the environment.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Arbogas?
So the question is on the financial sector, right?
Yes, sir. How can the public sector encourage more
Yeah.
green investments from the financial sector?
No, that's an excellent question, and it's so important. I think without the financial sector, there's no green transition. Let's put it that way. And when I mention financial sector, it's very broad, right? It's not just the banks. I mean, the banks alone will not be able to finance all the projects we're talking about here. Whether it's infrastructure or other, large amounts of money are needed. So capital markets are equally important. And this is something we really need to promote. So developing capital markets. Now, you mentioned the public sector and how we can encourage more green investments into the financial sector. I think what we've seen recently, some of the incentives, financial incentives that have been put in place by the regulator. I think those go in the right direction. Some regulatory relief on capital, for example, and so on. For the banks that the BSP supervises, I think to promote green projects, I think that's really a very nice step forward, and will definitely encourage banks to do more lending into that space. But banks are also facing a very simple problem, which is they don't have enough places where they can actually put their money in, right? Lend to which sectors? I'm sure they would love to do more infrastructure lending in certain sectors, but the projects again are just not there, or there is a lack of bankable projects, and that's again it goes to what I said. We need a better pipeline of bankable projects going forward, and then the financial sector can come in and finance that. And I also just want to mention the work at IFC we're doing to basically harness and catalyze the financial sector in the Philippines, with the objective of scaling up private sector financing for climate mitigation and adaptation through the local financial institutions and through the local capital markets. So the work we're doing there includes work on policy and regulatory work. So that's working with the regulators on how to supervise the banks. What does it mean, to look at climate risk and how they should be thinking about that when they supervise the banks. It includes also capacity building with investors like pension funds, for example, so they get familiar with the sectors or the new sectors that we're trying to develop. It's working with the banks to increase their green portfolio and better assess climate risk also, because for the banks, there's a lot of work to be done also to help them understand new sectors and help them understand how climate change can affect their own portfolio. And then finally, at IFC, we're also working with the real estate sector and the building sector, which is a large component of the economy that needs to be decarbonized. And as mentioned, we have tools, including this EDGE tool that helps developers to assess energy efficiency measures that they can put in place. So that program of ours is called the 30 by 30 Zero. It means by 2030, we'd like to see banks have 30% of their portfolio being green and have zero exposure to coal. That's an aspirational target we have.
Okay, thank you, sir. For Mr. Amanda, I'd like to tweak the question a bit. How can the public sector encourage more green investments from the energy sector?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Vic. No? Well, right now, in terms of the programs of the government, I think we have we have good programs in place already, which are what I've mentioned. No? You have good incentives under the renewable energy law, for example, and then we have the different mechanisms in place under the RE law that would promote the use of renewable energy. So the green energy auction program that I mentioned is a good one. No? I think with respect to the DOF, the BSP, the SEC, they've also issued their respective circulars and frameworks to actually support on the financing side. No? So we can work together, with this, to better encourage investments moving forward.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is, in what ways can the public and private sector work together to ease the transition to clean energy? We will start with Yusek Bekson.
Well, if we are then talking of partnerships, then this is not new. So it's something that is going on, and we just need to make sure that projects that come out of these partnerships address those green and sustainability issues. There is, of course, always tremendous pressure to economize or to reduce the cost of a project. And that is where sustainability, resiliency, solutions, decarbonization, the things I heard earlier, capturing carbon, these are technologies that don't come free. So how do we then have PPPs that would have these as part of the structure of the project? So that is, I think, what what we need to think about. And so, again, as I was saying earlier, uh, I identified three parties that have big roles here. You know? So, on the one side would be the policymakers. You know? So, policymakers set the rules, and one 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 question, for example, that we have to address is what is a green infrastructure in the Philippine context? What is sustainable infrastructure in the Philippine context? Because we have all different ideas, and those would come with different costs. So, but we need investors to have more clarity on these things. Uh, I also said that those that review projects uh, would also have to look at these projects in a different way so that green and say sustainable the sustainability matters or issues are actually being considered as projects are being evaluated, and the regulators, as I have already explained earlier.
Okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Arbogast. The question
Thank you.
is, yeah,
Same question? I don't know.
yes, go ahead, please. Same question.
So transition to clean energy. I think Yusek Pexon, you mentioned two really important points, and they really resonate with me. On the one on the predictability, right? I think investors need to know what's what the framework will look like, not just a year or two ahead of time, but also 10 years ahead of time. I mean, when they put in money and resources, are they sure that the operating world in which they are will still be the same, years down the road? And I think that predictability is super, super important for investors to come in. And then the other aspect I also mentioned is on the evaluation of projects. Well, I think you need to look at stakeholders that are broader than just your own shareholders, right? You need to look at the local communities. You need to look at government entities, communities. I mean, a range of, your employees and your board. I mean, it's a very large range of shareholders as stakeholders you have to consider, and evaluating the impact on each of them separately, and include that in the way you assess your projects. And then I think there's another aspect which is quite important, where I think the government can help, and other partners and donors, which is blended finance and concessional finance. I think a lot of the technologies we're talking about, whether it's carbon capture or hydrogen, are very costly, are very risky still, and you need that soft money to help de-risk and help reduce the cost of those technologies. And I think that's really important, and that's a place where where the government and countries in general can really help.
Okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Avante, would you like to add to what they've said earlier? Same
Yeah,
question.
same question. Okay, thank you for that. I agree with what Yusek, Pexon, and Jean Mark mentioned, no? But I also wanted to probably focus a bit more on the policy side. No? Again, there are a lot of incentives right now and mechanisms that would actually encourage investors like us to further increase our capacity on renewable energy. But I think when we talk of transitioning to clean energy, it is also important that we address the elephant in the room, and that is coal. No, so as I've mentioned, with respect to greenhouse gas emissions of the Philippines, about 50% come from the energy sector, and a big contributor of that is because of the energy mix. If you look at the energy power generation mix of the country in 2015, about mid 40s is coal. And then by 2020, it has increased by about mid 50s, about 54%, if I'm not mistaken. And as I've mentioned, if you compare the carbon footprint of a coal plant versus a geothermal plant like EDC, the carbon footprint of a coal plant is 7 times more. So that's one. No? I think we need to accelerate the retirement of coal plants and probably expand the coal moratorium. Right now, I think we have about 11 gigawatts of installed coal, no, and median age of roughly less than 10 years. And then with the coal moratorium, it actually provided exemptions on plants that are actually in the pipeline or in the planning stage right now. So we could see a situation that even by 2040, we would still have about 10 gigawatts, no, of installed capacity of coal, no. Now, I like the recent announcement of the Department of Finance about a multi-billion-dollar ADB-backed facility, called Energy Transition Mechanism. So that should hasten the retirement of coal plants and increase the investment in renewable energy. So I think we need to address that. Financing also plays an important role. A lot of foreign banks and I think some local banks have already made public declaration to stop funding coal. No? So that's very crucial. And then siguro on the tax side, right? If you look at the train law, for example, they have increased the excise tax on coal to 150 pesos per metric ton. Right now, with the price of Newcastle at about close to 180, if I'm not mistaken, that's roughly around 2% only. But if you talk of transition fuel, which globally I think it is regarded that natural gas is a transition fuel, no, as we go into pure renewable energy in the future. In the Philippines, for example, because of the Malampaya, where we source 100% of our gas, it is taxed roughly at 50% of its fuel cost. No? So there's a big disparity, and probably that's an area that we can look into. No? And then siguro finally na lang, in addition to addressing the coal issue, it's really aligning the grid regulation and planning. No? Because renewable energy, you cannot put it anywhere. It is normally in areas where you get the source. No? So like, for example, geothermal, you situate it in existing volcanoes. For wind, you go where there is wind, right? And then solar also where there's flat land and a lot of solar radiation. So we have to make sure that in terms of transmission of grid planning, these are considered so that there is a venue for these companies or for this renewable energy to actually export and sell their power to going forward.
Yeah. Just a follow-up question. We're a few months away from national elections. How confident are you that this moratorium on new coal plants, will be carried on by the next administration? And
Well,
for
we're
Mr. Arbogast, would you also like to add or give your insight on this?
Yep. Well, we're very hopeful, Vic, no, that the next administration will be able to continue whatever the current administration has as far as supporting the renewable energy. The current administration is very supportive, as I've mentioned. They've actually put in place a lot of frameworks. So hopefully they will be able to continue that and probably consider more, to better ease the transition to more renewable energy moving forward.
Mr. Arbogast, do you have a similar program like what ADB has put in place?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we're very keen also to support the coal transition, of course, and support new technologies that will come in the country, and that means it's one side is about decommissioning existing coal plants, and we need to be careful what we do there because energy security, energy affordability, and equity are all very important aspects. Also, I think for the country, power is very expensive already here. So, but I think on the investment side and for the new generation, there is an incredible amount of demand that is needed, for the next decade. It goes into the tens of gigawatts of installed capacity, that will need to be added to meet the demand. And I think this is really where we want to focus and focus our efforts on renewable energy and clean energy.
Okay. Yusek Paxson, would you like to give your comment on the topic, or would you like us to move on?
Well, it's actually outside my field, so I'll bow to the two gentlemen.
Yeah, I think um, we can take a question from our audience. Okay, sorry. Um, I would like, I think we're running out of time, so I would like to give you a chance to give your closing remarks. We will start with Yusek Paxson.
Okay. So, well, first, I'd like to thank Business World for having this forum, and I actually congratulate you as well. And I hope we will have more of these fora because, as we have said or we've heard in the beginning, that sustainability is no longer an option. It is actually something that we have to work towards. Uh, and as we are also all realizing, it requires both the private sector and the public sector working together. So we at the PPP Center are very supportive of this transition, and we remain to be available to assist our fellow agencies in government who actually implement these projects and assist in whatever way we can within our mandate to come up with a robust pipeline of green and sustainable infrastructure projects because financing alone, having capital alone will not get us there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Avante, your closing remarks, please.
Okay, thanks, Vic. Again, thank you, Business World, for inviting me to participate in this forum. It's been an honor to be part of this dialogue now with distinguished guests at this time when climate change is an important issue. My takeaway is that, and closing remark is that it will take a Herculean effort to avert a climate crisis in the future and ease our transition to a greener world now. But I believe the energy sector, which I'm a part of, plays an important role now as we account 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the country. But with the right policies, enforcements, and incentives from the government, support of local and foreign financial institutions for sustainability financing, and the technical expertise and investment by the private sector, I think we can all collaboratively make into reality a decarbonized and regenerative future. Thank you.
Mr. Arbogast.
Thank you, and thanks again to Business World for organizing this very good forum, very good discussion, and for having me here. It's been a great pleasure and honor. I just want to mention that again, timing of this type of discussion is extremely good. We need partnerships. We need partnerships between public, between private. That's what we heard. I think neither the public sector nor the private sector can do this alone. There's a tremendous amount of investments that are required. We also need to create those investment opportunities, and it's my hope that development finance institutions like the International Finance Corporation (IFC), together with other development partners, we are able to create that right environment that makes it conducive for the private sector to come in and help also the public side on capacity building that will be required to have that successful green transition. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Um, with that, many thanks to our speakers for sharing your insights, Yusek Pexon, Mr. Arbogast, and Mr. Avante, and to our partner organizations, British Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Management Association of the Philippines, Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and to our media partner, the Philippine Star. And of course, to everyone who joined us today, thank you very much. Be sure to tune in to Business World social media pages to be updated on our next projects. Again, this is Victor Saulon, and this has been Business World Insights. Good afternoon.